For 32 years, my brother Jonas drove 210 miles every second Tuesday of the month to a mountain town he claimed he couldn't stand. He told me he was helping an old shipyard buddy who had fallen on hard times. I never questioned him. When you grow up sharing a bedroom, when you watch someone build a life out of grease and hard work, you don't ask for receipts, you trust them. But when Jonas died of a sudden stroke at 61, I drove to that mountain town myself to give the buddy the news in person. That was when the ground beneath my feet gave way. There was no shipyard buddy. There was no old friend waiting at the end of that road. Instead, there was a quiet street, a small brick house with blue shutters, and a secret sitting in a heavy steel box for over 3 decades. A secret that would pull the masks off my own family and show me exactly who I had been sharing my name with. Before I tell you how a retired port manager brought a pack of young vultures to their knees, please hit that subscribe button. Tell me in the comments if you have ever buried a family member, only to realize you didn't know them at all. My name is Harvey Garner. I'm 65 years old. For 36 years, I worked as a cargo operations manager at the Port of Virginia in Norfolk, coordinating the massive container ships. It was a loud, stressful job that took my youth and gave me a decent pension and a bad back. My wife, Sarah, passed away 9 years ago, and since then, the quiet in my house has been too heavy. Jonas was my younger brother, and after Sarah died, he was the only real family I had left who cared to pick up the phone. Or so I thought. The day we put Jonas in the ground was one of those suffocating Virginia summer days where the air feels like wet wool. The cemetery was on a dry slope just outside Norfolk, and the heat was rising off the yellow grass. I stood in my dark suit, sweating through my collar, watching the priest read from the Book of Psalms. Standing a few feet away were my niece Audrey and my nephew Justin. Audrey is 36, a corporate accountant in Charlotte who lives in a house she can't afford and speaks to people like she's doing them a favor by breathing. Justin is 33, a commercial real estate broker in Norfolk who spends more time leasing sports cars than closing deals. Next to him was his wife, Nadia, a woman of 32, who I have never seen smile without checking if there was a camera nearby. Those 2 kids were Jonas's only blood, but they hadn't seen their father in 15 years. When Jonas and their mother divorced in 2011, Audrey and Justin chose the side of the family that had money, cutting Jonas out completely. They didn't call him when he had double pneumonia 4 years ago. They didn't send a card on his 60th birthday. They didn't show up at the hospital when his heart gave out. But the moment they heard he was dead, they were on the first highway back. They weren't there to mourn. They were there to collect. Jonas had lived a simple life. After the divorce, he bought a tiny 2-bedroom fixer-upper near the shipyard and worked on old outboards. His only real asset, as far as the kids knew, was our family cabin at Lake Gaston. It was a rustic place built by our father in 1968, right on the water, with a wide pine porch where Jonas and I had spent every summer of our lives. Jonas took title to it after our father died because I already had my house in Norfolk. As soon as the service ended and the priest walked away, I stood by the grave, waiting. I waited for Audrey to come over and say she was sorry. I waited for Justin to shake my hand, maybe tell me a memory of his dad. I stood there like an old fool, expecting a shred of decency from the kids I used to buy Christmas presents for. Instead, Nadia walked up to me, her heels sinking into the dry cemetery dirt. She didn't offer condolences. She just looked at her watch and said, "Uncle Harvey, we need to talk about the Lake Gaston cabin before the lawyers get involved." I looked at her, my hands clenching. "My brother isn't even in the dirt yet, Nadia. Can this wait?" Nadia gave me that thin, practiced smile. "With respect, Harvey, there's no reason to drag this out." Justin and Audrey checked, and Jonas didn't leave a will. Under Virginia intestate law, his entire estate passes to his children. That means the cabin belongs to them now. We've already contacted an appraiser to get it listed by next week. We just wanted to let you know out of courtesy so you can pack up your personal things from the place. Courtesy. That was the word she used. She was giving me the courtesy of telling me that the cabin my father built, the place where I had taught Jonas how to clean a base, was being sold off to the highest bidder before the funeral flowers had even started to wilt. I looked at Justin. He was looking at his phone, adjusting his sunglasses. Audrey was already walking toward her Mercedes, not even looking back. They had it all figured out. A quick sale, a split check, and back to their expensive lives. A cold feeling washed over me. It wasn't sadness. It was something hard and heavy, like a steel gate locking. "We'll talk about it later," I said. I didn't go to the reception they booked at a steakhouse. I drove back to my house, took off my tight collar, and sat at the kitchen table. I poured a small glass of bourbon, watching the ice melt, and I started thinking about the last phone call I had with Jonas. It was 10 days before he died. He had called me on a Tuesday night, his voice sounding tired. We talked about the heat wave, about a carburetor he was rebuilding, and then right before he hung up, he said something that hadn't made sense at the time. "Harvey," he had said, "if my engine ever stops running, you need to go to Piedmont Trust in Clifton Forge. Ask for Julian Mercer, tell him you're my brother, and tell him it's time to open box 304. You'll understand why I made those drives." I had laughed it off, telling him he was too young to talk about engines stopping, but now, sitting in my empty kitchen, those words felt like a map left by a dying man. Clifton Forge was a small railroad town in the mountains, 210 miles away. That was the place Jonas drove to every second Tuesday of the month, at 8. The next morning, I got in my truck and started driving west. The drive to Clifton Forge took me a little over 3 hours. As my truck climbed higher into the mountains, the heavy Norfolk humidity began to lift, replaced by a cool wind. Clifton Forge was an old town, the kind built on coal and steam railways, with red brick buildings lining a quiet main street. It felt frozen in another era. I found Piedmont Trust near the old depot. The sign out front was faded wood, and the building looked like it had been standing since the 1920s. Inside, the lobby was small, with polished marble floors and brass teller cages. I walked up to the counter and asked the woman behind it if Julian Mercer was available. She asked for my name. When I told her I was Harvey Garner, her eyes widened. She didn't say a word. She just walked quickly toward a wood-paneled office at the back. A moment later, a man stepped out. He was tall, around 64, with silver hair and a quiet, dignified face. He walked over to me, extending a hand. "Harvey," he said, his voice low and steady. "I'm Julian. I've been waiting for you." He led me back into his office, closing the heavy door behind us. The office smelled of old paper and leather. Julian sat behind a desk cluttered with folders. He looked at me for a long time, as if searching my face for traces of my brother. "I was devastated to hear about Jonas," Julian said softly. "He was my closest friend. He spoke about you every single time he sat in that chair." I leaned forward, my hands resting on my knees. "Julian, my brother told me to come see you. He said something about safe deposit box 304. I don't understand. Jonas spent 32 years driving 210 miles to this town every second Tuesday. He told me he was helping an old buddy. Why did he come here?" Julian sighed, opening a drawer and pulling out a small brass key. "Jonas came here because this is where his real life was, Harvey. He couldn't live it in Norfolk, so he lived it here. Come with me." He led me down a carpeted hallway to the vault room. It was cool and smelled of steel. Julian used his key along with the bank's master key to pull out box 304. It was a long, heavy steel container. He placed it on a small table and patted my shoulder. "Take all the time you need, Harvey. I'll be outside." I sat alone in the room, the heavy steel door clicking shut behind Julian. I stared at the box for a full minute before I reached out and lifted the lid. Inside was a thick stack of manila envelopes, all labeled in Jonas's blocky handwriting. The very top envelope had my name on it. "For Harvey." I opened it and pulled out 3 pages of yellow legal paper covered in Jonas's handwriting. "Harvey," the letter began, "if you're reading this, my engine finally stopped. I'm sorry I never told you any of this while I was alive. I wanted to so many times, but I was afraid of how it would look. And I didn't want to bring my past mistakes to your door. The truth is, there was no shipyard buddy. The real reason I drove to Clifton Forge every second Tuesday was a woman named Clara Albright." The letter explained that back in 1994, when Jonas was 29, he had stopped at a local diner in Clifton Forge during one of his trucking routes. Clara was 24, working the morning shift, raising a 6-year-old daughter named Lily. Jonas wrote that he fell in love with her the moment she smiled at him. They started seeing each other, but Clara had a dark past. Her ex-husband had been a violent man who nearly killed her before he was sent to prison. Clara was so traumatized that she couldn't bear the thought of marriage, or even sharing a roof with another man. She needed her own space, her own door, and her own independence to feel safe. Jonas respected that. Instead of pushing her, he built a life around her needs. In 1996, he bought a small house just 2 streets away from Clara's cottage in Clifton Forge. He kept his tiny apartment in Norfolk for work. But every second Tuesday of the month and every other weekend and holiday, he was in Clifton Forge. He mowed Clara's lawn, fixed her roof, and raised Lily as his own daughter. He paid for Lily's braces, walked her to school, and eventually paid for her college and her nursing school. Clara passed away 10 years ago in a car accident, Jonas wrote. It nearly broke me, Harvey, but I stayed here for Lily. She's a nurse now, married to a good man named Mason, and she has a 6-year-old son. They are my real family, Harvey. The only ones who loved me for who I was, not for what they could get from me. My hands began to shake as I turned to the second page of the letter. This was where the numbers started. Jonas wrote that in 1985, when our father died, he had left each of us $30,000. I had used mine to pay the down payment on my brick house. In Norfolk, Jonas had taken his $30,000 and walked into Piedmont Trust, handing it to a young, ambitious commercial teller named Julian Mercer. He told Julian to invest it, to make it grow, and to never let anyone know about it, and Julian did. For 40 years, Julian quietly moved Jonas's money, reinvesting dividends, buying into early tech stocks and commercial real estate index funds. While Jonas was driving trucks and living in a modest fixer-upper, his wealth was growing silently behind the vault doors of Piedmont Trust. I set the letter down and opened the second envelope in the box. It was a certified financial statement from Piedmont Trust, dated 2 months before Jonas's death. I flipped to the summary page, my eyes scanning the final line. The total balance of Jonas's accounts was $32,450,000 and change. I sat back in my chair, the breath leaving my body. $32 million. My brother, who drove a dented pickup truck and wore flannel shirts with frayed collars, was a millionaire many times over. He had lived like a poor man, saving every penny, all so he could build a fortress of security for a woman and a child who had no legal claim to him. I wiped a tear from my eye, a mixture of grief and awe washing over me. He had carried this massive secret for 32 years, completely alone, protectively hiding it from everyone in Norfolk. But as I reached back into the steel box, I found a third envelope. This one was labeled The Ledger of Debs. I pulled the contents from the third envelope. Inside lay a bound black ledger, but behind it was a stack of signed papers, bank receipts, and canceled wire transfers. When I opened the ledger, I found my brother's blocky handwriting. But these pages weren't about investments or saving money. They were a log of the crimes and scandals of Audrey, Justin, and Nadia. As I read, the sheer greed and manipulation of the children who had abandoned my brother became disgustingly clear. They hadn't just cut Jonas out of their lives. They had actively used his quiet nature to clean up their dirt, making him pay for their silence. The first entry was from 2015. It was about Audrey. She had been caught embezzling funds from the regional agricultural firm she worked for in Charlotte Distribution Services. She was facing criminal charges under North Carolina law for corporate embezzlement. Jonas had quietly stepped in, transferring $120,000 to the firm's restitution account in exchange for their agreement not to file a criminal complaint. In the folder, Jonas had kept a formal promissory note, signed by Audrey herself, promising to repay the $120,000 upon demand. In the margins, Jonas had written a note that made my blood run cold. He wrote, Audrey showed up at my house in the middle of the night, crying hysterically, begging me for the $120,000. She swore she would visit me every Sunday and help take care of my house. She signed this note without hesitating. 2 weeks after the check cleared, she blocked my phone number. The next entry, dated 2018, was about Justin. He had been sued for civil conspiracy and commercial real estate fraud in Norfolk, accused of inflating building valuations in a commercial deal. The civil lawsuit threatened to destroy his licensing and send him to court. Jonas had paid $150,000 to settle the claim out of court. Justin had signed a similar promissory note, pledging his future inheritance or assets as collateral for the $150,000 loan. Jonas's note read, Justin took the money, and 2 weeks later, he leased a brand new BMW. When I asked him about the note, he laughed and told me he didn't think I would ever actually enforce it against my own flesh and blood. The third major entry was from 2021, and it involved Nadia. She had been caught in a credit card fraud scheme, using stolen retail cards to buy high-end designer merchandise, violating Virginia Code Section 18.2192. To keep the merchant and a private security firm from calling the state police, Jonas had paid $90,000 in cash restitution. Nadia had signed a promissory note for the debt. Jonas had written, "Nadia didn't even say thank you. She told Justin that it was my duty to help them, because I was just a lonely truck driver with nothing else to spend my money on." At the bottom of the ledger page, Jonas had written a short paragraph. "I am paying these debts for Harvey's sake, not for theirs. If Harvey knew what his niece and nephew had done, it would break his heart. He raised them to be decent. I am buying their silence so my brother can sleep at night, but they will not inherit a single penny of my labor. I will hold these notes until the end." The total amount Jonas had paid to clean up their messes, including the interest calculated at the federal prime rate as specified in the promissory notes, came to exactly $680,000. I sat in the vault room, my stomach turning. The children who had stood at my brother's grave and talked about appraising the Gaston cabin were criminals. They had treated their father like a human bank account, signing notes they never intended to pay, and then cutting him out when they didn't need him. I closed the ledger and stepped out of the vault room. Julian was waiting for me. He looked at the ledger in my hands and nodded quietly. "He kept it all legal, Harvey," Julian said. "He wanted to protect you, but he also wanted to make sure they paid for what they did. He hired Preston Halloway 8 years ago to write his will." Preston Halloway was a top estate attorney in Norfolk, a man known for being thorough. Julian told me that Preston was already in Clifton Forge, waiting to meet me at a local diner down the street. I walked out of Piedmont Trust and met Preston Halloway at the diner. The diner was quiet, with a few locals drinking coffee. I sat in a corner booth, looking out the window at the peaceful mountain town, realizing how much Jonas had loved this place. Preston laid out the documents on the table, showing me the official, notarized will that Jonas had signed. The will named me, Harvey Garner, as the sole executor of the estate. It left the bulk of his $32,450,000 fortune to Lily Albright, the girl Jonas had raised as his daughter. It left small symbolic bequests of $5,000 each to Audrey and Justin. But there was a catch. The will contains an enforceable no-contest clause under Virginia Code Section 64.2-400. Preston explained, tapping the paper. If Justin or Audrey attempt to contest the will, they forfeit their $5,000 bequest. Furthermore, Jonas specifically instructed me to file a claim against them to recover the $680,000 in promissory notes immediately upon his death. The estate is legally required to collect these debts. "And what about the Lake Gaston cabin?" I asked. Preston smiled thinly. "The cabin isn't even part of the probate estate, Harvey. Jonas deeded the property to the Jonas Garner Living Trust back in 2012. Lily Albright is the sole beneficiary of that trust. The cabin belongs to her now. Justin and Audrey have absolutely no claim to it." I felt a massive weight lift off my shoulders. Jonas had protected me. He had protected the cabin, and he had set a trap for the children who had discarded him. "How soon can we set up a meeting?" I asked. "I've already contacted them," Preston said. "We are meeting in my Norfolk office in 3 days. They think they are coming to sign the paperwork to claim the cabin." I drove back to Norfolk that afternoon, the black ledger sitting on the passenger seat of my truck. For the first time since Jonas's death, I slept through the night. 3 days later, I walked into the high-rise office of Preston Halloway in downtown Norfolk. The glass conference room looked out over the Elizabeth River, where cargo vessels glided slowly through the shipping channels. Audrey, Justin, and Nadia were already sitting around the massive mahogany table. Audrey had her expensive designer sunglasses perched on her head, looking bored. Justin was tapping his foot, checking a Rolex that I knew he couldn't afford. Nadia wore a bright, calculating smile, clearly expecting a quick signing that would secure the Lake Gaston cabin. "Thanks for coming," I said, sitting at the head of the table. Preston sat to my right, opening his thick leather briefcase. Justin leaned back in his leather chair. Look, Uncle Harvey, we appreciate the meeting, but let's make this quick. We have an appraiser visiting the Gaston cabin tomorrow. We just need to sign the transfer papers so we can put it on the market. There's no reason to drag this out. Preston Halloway didn't look up from his papers. He adjusted his glasses, pulled out a thick document, and set it on the mahogany table. Mr. Garner, Mrs. Garner, there are no transfer papers, because the cabin at Lake Gaston does not belong to you. Audrey's bored expression vanished. What do you mean it doesn't belong to us? Our father died without a will. By law, everything goes to his children. We checked the county records. Your father did not die intestate, Preston said, his voice cold and precise. He left a comprehensive, notarized will that was filed with my office 8 years ago. Under the terms of the will, his entire estate is valued at $32,450,000. There was a sudden, absolute silence in the room. You could have heard a pin drop on the thick carpet. Justin's mouth actually came open. Nadia's fake smile froze, her eyes scanning the paper in Preston's hand, as if trying to read the numbers through the back of the page. 32 million? Justin whispered, his voice cracking. He looked at Audrey, then at me. How did a truck driver have $32 million? That is not your concern, Preston said. What concerns you is the distribution. Your father left specific symbolic bequests of $5. Thous own each to Audrey Garner and Justin Garner. The remaining balance of the estate, including all investments and cash accounts, has been left to his primary beneficiary, Lily Albright. Who the hell is Lily Albright? Audrey screamed, slamming her hands on the table. She stood up, her face turning a deep, angry red. This is fraud. My father was a truck driver who lived in a dump. He didn't have $32 million. And he certainly didn't leave it to some random woman. We will contest this will. We'll tie it up in court for years. Preston Halloway smiled, a slow, dangerous smile. You are welcome to try, Ms. Garner. However, the will contains a strict no-contest clause under Virginia Code, Section 64.2400. If you file any legal challenge to this will, you forfeit your $5,000 bequest immediately. I don't care about $5,000, Audrey spat, her voice echoing in the conference room. We're talking about $32 million. We have absolutely nothing to lose by contesting it. Actually, I spoke up, my voice calm and low, you have everything to lose. I reached into my briefcase, pulled out the black ledger, and placed it in the center of the table. Behind it, Preston stacked the 3 promissory notes, the canceled bank wire receipts, and the copy of the Charlotte Distribution Services restitution agreement. What is that? Justin asked, his voice shaking. This is the cost of your silence, I said, looking my nephew dead in the eye. Audrey, this is the $120. Zeros and your father paid in 2015 to Charlotte Distribution Services to stop them from prosecuting you for corporate embezzlement. The check was paid from his Piedmont Trust account. And here is the promissory note you signed, promising to repay the loan on demand. Audrey's face went from red to a ghostly, chalky white. She sank back into her chair, her hand covering her mouth. Justin, I continued, turning to my nephew, this is the $150. Thous own your father paid in 2018 to settle your commercial real estate fraud lawsuit in Norfolk. Here is your signature on the promissory note. Justin stared at the paper, his hands trembling. He looked like the 9-year-old boy who had lost his baseball mitt, completely terrified and helpless. And Nadia, I said, shifting my gaze to his wife, who had gone completely stiff. This is the $90. Thous and your father paid in cash to drop the credit card theft charges against you under Virginia Code, Section 18.2-192. Here is your signed note. I tapped the black ledger. Your father kept every receipt. He kept every wire transfer. And because he was a smart investor, he had you sign these notes as formal legal debts to be collected by his estate upon his death, with interest calculated at the federal prime rate. The total outstanding balance you owe to the estate is exactly $680,000. Preston Halloway slid a formal demand letter across the mahogany table, stopping right in front of Justin. As the executor of the estate, Harvey Garner is legally required to call in these notes, Preston explained. The estate demands full repayment of the $680,000 within 30 days. If the funds are not received, the estate will file civil suits, attach your corporate wages, freeze your commercial accounts, and pursue every available collection remedy under Virginia law. You can't do this, Nadia whispered, her voice cracking. We don't have that kind of money. We have a mortgage. We have leases. You should have thought about that before you treated my brother like a trash can for your crimes, I said. Justin put his head in his hands and began to cry, his shoulders shaking. Audrey was staring at the table, her eyes blank with shock. They had come to steal a cabin, and instead, they were walking out with a $680,000 debt that would ruin their lives. Justin kept crying, the ugly, ragged sound of a 33-year-old man, realizing his arrogance, had finally painted him into a corner. He looked up at me, his eyes bloodshot behind his designer glasses. "Uncle Harvey, please," Justin begged, his voice cracked with panic. "I have a kid. I have a mortgage on the beach house. If they freeze my brokerage account, I'll lose my commercial license. I can't come up with that money. You have to stop this, Will. You're the executor." I looked at my nephew, and for a second I saw the little boy who used to come stay at my house every summer. The boy I took fishing on Lake Gaston. The boy who was loved by a father he later decided wasn't rich enough to acknowledge. "Justin," I said, my voice quiet but hard. "Your father saved you from a federal courtroom. He paid $150, zeros in cash to clear your name and keep your career intact. And he did it without ever asking you for a thank you, all because he loved me and didn't want my heart to break. You repaid him by refusing to visit him when he was sick, and by trying to sell his cabin before he was even buried. You will pay the estate back. You will pay every single cent with interest. And when you are done in 15 or 20 years, you will finally understand what it cost your father to love you. Maybe by then you will be worth loving." I stood up, picked up the black ledger, and nodded to Preston. We walked out of the glass conference room, leaving the three of them sitting there in the silence of their own ruin. Over the next few months, the emails and phone calls from Audrey were constant. She begged, she pleaded, and she even threatened to sue me personally for breach of fiduciary duty. She claimed she was my family, my blood. I blocked her number and let Preston Halloway handle all correspondence. When she realized I wouldn't budge, the panic set in. That weekend, I drove down to Clifton Forge to meet Lily Albright. She was a nurse at the local regional hospital. She had a kind, tired face and the same warm eyes my brother had described in his letter. She had her 6-year-old son, Jonas Arthur Wilkes, balanced on her hip. When she saw me, she didn't ask about the money or the estate. She just wrapped her arms around my neck and hugged me tightly. "He talked about you every single day, Uncle Harvey," Lily whispered, her eyes shining. "He always said his big brother was the strongest, most honest man he knew. I feel like I've known you my whole life." I looked at the little boy on her hip, who was looking at my watch with curiosity. He had my brother's blocky forehead and stubborn chin. I held out my hand, and his small, warm fingers wrapped around my thumb. "I'm your Uncle Harvey," I told him. Later that month, I drove Lily and little Jonas out to the Lake Gaston cabin. I stood on the pine porch that my father had built in 1968, watching Lily sweep the dust from the pine floorboards. Little Jonas was already at the edge of the dock, holding a small plastic fishing rod I had bought him, asking me how to bait a hook. Looking at them, I felt the heavy emptiness in my chest finally start to dissolve. The money did not change my life, because at 65 you realize that money is just paper. The real inheritance was what Jonas had built in Clifton Forge, a legacy of quiet decency, a daughter who loved him, and a grandson who carried his name. He had spent 32 years quietly being a better man than any of us deserved, paying for the sins of his ungrateful children to protect my peace, and carrying his loneliness in silence. I drive down to Clifton Forge every second Tuesday of the month now. I sit in the diner where Clara used to work, order the meatloaf, and leave a $100 tip for the waitress. Then I drive to Lily's house, sit on the front porch, and read stories to little Jonas while he does his homework. Audrey filed for bankruptcy 9 months after that meeting, losing her accounting certification. Nadia left Justin in the spring, moving to a town outside Atlanta with a man whose name I have not bothered to learn. Justin has been making monthly payments to the estate, late and grudging, but he is paying. I do not wish them harm, nor do I wish them well. I only wish them the truth, which is a fair accounting. My brother left one last card at the bottom of the steel box. It had 2 sentences in his blocky print. Harvey, you were never the smart one. You were the good one. Be good a little longer for me. I keep that card in my wallet. I read it every second Tuesday before I start the truck. Decency is not weakness. Quiet is not absence, and sometimes the quietest man in the family is the one carrying the heaviest load, waiting for the lights to finally come on. Money has a way of pulling masks off the people who wear them. Sometimes the quietest person in the family is carrying the heaviest load, and sometimes the loudest ones at the funeral are the ones who never knew the deceased at all. If you have ever been underestimated, betrayed, or written off by your own blood, do me a favor. Stand up anyway. Walk out into the light anyway. The people who tried to bury you are usually the ones who handed you the shovel without realizing what you were going to dig up. Tell me your story in the comments. Hit that subscribe button. And remember, dignity is not what people give you. Dignity is what nobody can take.